Welcome to the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. In the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, we are joined by special guests talking about their experiences, the realities of investigating crimes, plus those who have experienced horrendous trauma. Police, first responders, military, and victims of crime share their stories. Hi, I'm John J. Wiley. In addition to being a broadcaster, I'm also a retired police sergeant. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com, and also like us on Facebook. Search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Got a very special guest on the phone calling from, I got to be honest, Rod, I don't know where you're calling from. You're calling from Louisiana? Or you California? Where?
Yeah, Shreveport, Louisiana.
Shreveport, Louisiana. We have television star Rod Demery, and I say that with the utmost respect, also retired Shreveport, Louisiana homicide detective. If I'm correct, you did 25 total years in law enforcement before becoming a television star.
Right, exactly. 4 years active military. It's been a long ride.
Thank you for your service in the military and also as a police. And I got to tell you, before we go to the conversation, I watched an episode just recently of this show, Murder Chose Me, which is on Investigation Discovery Channel. And the show episode I watched, Rod, was about a young lady who was several months pregnant who was murdered, found floating in a pond. And I was mesmerized by the show, not just the creative aspect and how it was presented, which I think is phenomenal, but I was listening to you talk in this television show, and I was like, I know this guy. You sound so much like the police and the homicide detectives I worked with in Baltimore. It was incredible. And Baltimore and Shreveport are like totally different ends of the country.
But Baltimore and Shreveport are kind of alike, other than obviously the size. But we deal with the same type demographic, and homicide per capita, it's above average, and I think that's correct because I saw some Baltimore police officers, and I read Baltimore homicide on the Life on the Street book, and I felt the same way. It's like I feel like I know these guys because it's the same mindset, the same way of thinking, the same way of doing things.
Even some of the language that you used was so remarkably similar to guys I worked with. My wife was looking back going, Steph, I talk like that. I know guys that talk just like that. It was so realistic. You don't get that very often in any type of television presentation or police work. So my hat's off to you and the crew.
Yeah, thank you. Baltimore police and Baltimore homicide in particular, man, that's a nationwide respect. I think most people, whether they admit it or not, they kind of pattern themselves after Baltimore. I mean, they're the real police, and it's kind of one of those things that everybody kind of loves. So
yeah,
I think everything that they've done, that mentions their police department has always been successful.
Well, thank you. Now, I'll tell my friends and my brothers up there that you send accolades. Let's talk a little bit. First, the show, you got a new season coming up this week. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think the new season, and for me personally, I like it a little better because it's a little more hard-hitting, a little more action-packed, and some of the raw homicides are there. The realism this season, and we had a great season last season, but I think the fact that everyone has done it, and we just got better. I think. Some of the homicides are, there's a wide variety of homicides and different types of homicides, and yet they're all the same, but the stories are always different in the circumstances and the people. So, but at the end of the day, I think it's a much better season, personally.
And that's on Investigation Discovery. You can check it out. What night of the week is the show on?
Wednesday nights, 9 Central, 10 Eastern.
Now, if you're like me, you'll just set the DVR to record, and I've got to go start doing some binge watching on the past episodes because I've never really had a chance to watch it. Typically with crime recreation stories, they tend to look rather like vanilla or tapioca pudding. It's just like, I know what you're getting at, but it's just lacking substance and creativity. I didn't get that feel from Murder Chose Me at all. It's definitely got a very realistic flair to it. And by the way, a big congratulations to the young man who portrays you, the actor. I don't know his name. Yeah. He does a great job.
John Nicholson. He's actually a New Yorker, but he lives in Los Angeles. I think the realism, obviously from great writing, and the producers are phenomenal, and directors, but there's a lot of input from the Knoxville Police Department in Knoxville, Tennessee. So you see real police out, and some of the little nuances that were kind of lost in some of the other shows in the past. You can see actual police officers doing actual things. So some of the extras, and in fact some of the technical advice is, as far as searching a building even, or holding a firearm, coming from police. So I think that kind of brings a lot to it.
Yeah, I believe it does. And it also has a good deal of reality when it comes to the emotional aspect and emotional portrayal of you and the other officers on the scene, because you've actually had, at least in that one episode, you had little flashes of emotion where you said, I was taking the interview, the guy was confessing, and you're sitting there and you have to be as ambivalent as possible, and you almost have to act like you are their buddy, their friend, and you said, I wanted to choke the bleep out of the guy. And I thought that's exactly how I know countless police across the United States were going, I know exactly how that feels, that where you're like, I want to do this, but we don't.
Yeah, and I think that's just a God-given restraint that police have. We know that the bigger picture, the end result is actually closing the case. I mean, that's what it all boils down to, and I think it's that ability that police officers have. And most police officers that I've met have that ability to kind of suspend whatever emotion they may have and look at the big picture. It's truly a God-given gift, because I don't know that many people can, other than most police officers. I think police officers just have an uncanny way of being able to suspend their emotions and, getting the job done.
Yeah. If you're not blessed with that, you'll certainly develop it over time, because you develop a thick skin and almost like a suit of armor where you have to shield yourself from the really heavy-duty negative emotional aspects of. For example, one of the things I hated doing more than anything else in police work was death notifications.
Oh, yeah.
And I know as a homicide detective that you did that a lot. And our policy in Baltimore was, if we got a phone call, let's say from Ohio, that someone was killed in an accident and the family needed me to be notified, we never did it over the phone. You always sent a police officer or someone to their door, no matter what time it was. And that's, I still think, the hardest thing I ever had to do, because there's no book written on how to do it.
Yeah, I think about it. I realize that that's the only part of an investigation or homicide investigation that you actually take personal, because you have to be there. You have to deal with the emotions, and just kind of be there for the person. And as you know, it's always a different reaction. Some people pass out, some people grab you, some people hit you.
Yeah.
But the reality is, I think that's the most emotional part. And for me, it was something that motivated me, because it's very difficult to look at somebody and make a notification and say, your son, your daughter, or your husband, your wife has died or has been murdered, and not feel a certain sense of responsibility. So it works as a motivator too, because you really can't go home until you go back and tell these people something that's going to give them a little comfort. So I think probably we can deal with the gory crime scenes and the bodies and all those things that come along with it, because we got that compartmentalized, and we can just, make a piece of evidence. But when you're dealing with somebody who looks at you, looks deep into your eyes, and they're hopeless, and you really don't have anything you can give them except the best you can to find the person who did it. So I think that's why it's probably the most difficult, because you automatically, if you're a human, you automatically relate to that person. It's just a human connection.
Folks, we are talking with Rod Demery, retired Shreveport, Louisiana homicide detective, U.S. military veteran, television star of the Investigation Discovery Channel television show Murder Chose Me. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Someone asked, what's the catch? What's the cost? There is no cost for anything on the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast website, letradio.com. letradio.com. Again, that's letradio.com.
Welcome back to the studios. Joining us from Shreveport, Louisiana, Rod Demery. Rod, I'm so impressed, that I get to spend some time on the phone with you. And I'm so thankful to the people at Discovery Channel for making this happen. But I'm really even more thankful that somebody had some insight to say, let's get this man and his stories, his policing stories, and let's tell them to everybody because, first of all, how did that happen? How did you go from policing to being a television star?
Well, that case that you talked about with the young pregnant girl, a production company was actually doing a show on her murder for another television show, and I was interviewed on it. And there was another murder that I worked that they came out and interviewed me on, and a couple months later, the field producer told me, hey, I'm going to have somebody call you that may want to talk to you about some other cases. And honestly, before I even knew it, I was interviewing, doing sizzle reels, and flying to New York. And I think probably halfway into it, I realized, I said, well, man, this is going to be actually a show about my cases. So it was pretty phenomenal. I think that all those things come together, all those pieces come together. And, you being a police, you understand, that we have a spirituality about ourselves, that we know everything works for a reason, for a plan. And I think all the way up until that point throughout my life, I was being prepared to be a homicide detective. And the funny thing is, we don't realize it until after it's done. So just fortunate enough to figure out that's what it was.
And that's a tough job, not just emotionally, but physically. Many people don't realize, like when they watch a show, Murder Chose Me, that you may be actively working for 36, 40, 48 hours and then go home, take a shower, and then back at it, maybe after a 2-hour nap. The grind is extreme.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, I took a lot of that for granted, actually. I bought a house maybe 12, 13 years ago, and it wasn't until I left the police department and left homicide that I realized that I had a living room and a kitchen and all those other things, because I'd come home and I'd literally just fall out and go to sleep, take a shower, and go back out. And it takes a toll. But there's that fuel, and you and every other police officer knows that it's impossible to get tired, and when you finally get it done, then, you're just out of it, but you forget everything else. And I think that's the one drawback, is that you kind of suspend everything else in your life, because at that particular moment, working cases is the only thing that really matters. I don't doubt there's a reason why there's such a high divorce rate or that type of thing, because you can't. I mean, it's difficult to think about anything other than that case.
One of the things that happened to me is that I was a drug cop for many years, and getting under a surveillance and being on a watch for long periods of time, and of course dealing with all the violence, and then you come home after working 24, 26, 28 hours, I'd be in mental shutdown mode and didn't want to talk to anybody. And it wasn't that I was being rude, but it turns out in the long run, I just wasn't as available as I should be, or maybe someone in another career for their spouse. I just wasn't there, even though I was physically there.
Yeah, and I think that's something that law enforcement should probably start looking at, because that's exactly what it is. You kind of spend yourself emotionally and mentally at work, and then you go home, you just shut down. And I don't know many people understand that. And even spouses that say they understand that. I mean, even law enforcement spouses don't understand that. But the reality is that, your mind has to kind of reboot. And, it's really difficult, and the things that are important to everybody else didn't really seem important to you as a police officer, a narco especially, because you're wrapped up in that case. It's a big deal. And the same with homicide. Maintaining a relationship like it's your sweetheart's birthday or something, and totally forgot. They'll call you when you're in a crime scene. Yeah, they call you in a crime scene. Like, why is she so selfish? Man, this person will never have another birthday. So it's a world that you got to kind of have to balance. And I think law enforcement is starting to evolve to a point where they can actually realize that police officers need time to recharge, and we're overworked, and we always have been. It's not that we even mind it. I think it's probably the acknowledgement that we don't get, that people probably should extend more.
I think you're 100% right. It was the little things that people said. I've been thanked more for my service as a police now that I've been retired all these years than ever when I worked the job, ever.
Yeah, exactly. I think people are becoming more aware of it. Fortunately, things like this show and a lot of the other law enforcement awareness is starting to seep out there just a little bit. There's always that political and controversial side of it that people like to see and talk about. But the reality is when people have more and more contact with police, and they meet good police, and they they realize what you're there for. Unfortunately, there's always going to be those that spout that venom about police and how horrible they are. But the reality is when things get hot, they're going to call you.
They will. And we handled calls with people, we liked them or not. It didn't matter. We handled it. And like homicides, it didn't matter the walk of life that the person who was murdered, the murder victim, it did not matter whether they came from Yale or jail. We went after trying to find their killer just as hard.
I tell you what, you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things that I taught some classes at the academy before I retired, and I said exactly those things. I said, it doesn't matter who the victim is because it's a human, and regardless, up until that point, it doesn't matter what they did. They've been a victim of crime, and more importantly, their surviving family has been. Children that got to grow up without them, so you owe them that. And the other thing is that we, as much as people think, we don't have the luxury to like or dislike people, and even though sometimes police officers spout off things that seem to be biased or prejudiced in one way or the other, the reality is that we don't care. If somebody's in trouble, we're there, and that's the way it's. I think that's the way it's always been, and it always will be. Obviously there are some issues, but the reality is that you're hard to find a real police that. They'll go to the wall for a junkie or a millionaire. They don't really care.
No, and the ones that got to me most upset were always involving children and the elderly, people that seem to not be able to defend themselves. That one always hit me harder than I'd say anything else. And child abuse cases were just brutal to deal with.
Yeah, and I think that's because we automatically recognize, a defenseless victim, someone that can't protect himself. It's like, what kind of person are you? Some kid doesn't know what's happening, or this elderly person, or, I always say that police officers love babies, puppies, and old people because, they're innocent and they're defenseless. And, it's very difficult to find somebody that would want to hurt somebody like that and have any respect for them at all. So, yeah, I think it's the fact that we naturally do it. I think that's God's way of making us who we are. It's like, pick on me. You want to pick on somebody. So
that takes me back to the story I watched, the episode involving the young woman who's pregnant, found murdered floating in a pond. And I got to be honest with you, my wife was watching the episode with me, and she was aghast at the brutality that this young woman suffered, not just during the murder, but the assault that occurred a few weeks later, or earlier, I should say.
Oh, yeah.
That like, how can someone, and this happens all the time, you know this, I know this, but someone listening that's never been a police you would be amazed at the violence so-called loved ones inflict upon each other.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. I mean, in that particular case, it's like, how can anyone be that brutal, and just lack any human emotion, not even necessarily just evil, but I mean, it's like, how do you go to that place where you're not a person anymore, or you can't relate to a person? But in that case, and that was a tough case, and it was just that, to find out all the details and listen to his statement. And when I made that expression that I wanted to really choke him was because you can imagine this young pregnant woman saying, just go away, I love you, and I never do this to you. It's just like pleading for your life, and how terrifying that's got to be, and it kind of makes your blood boil because. The level of violence and brutality is sometimes amazing that people actually possess. And all for nothing.
Exactly. You say, well, why didn't you just get a divorce? Why don't you just do... There's so many things that defy logical thinking. And I remember being a young rookie officer, and I was just really upset about a murder. I don't remember the details anymore, Rod, to be honest with you. And an old-time police, I mean, he had probably about 25 years on. He goes, listen, don't try to make sense in your mind of things that are totally nonsensical, that are totally insane, that are totally illogical, because it'll just drive you out of your mind, and you'll never come to peace with it. Accept it for what it is. It's horrific violence, and it's happening all over the country. We're going to take a short break. We are talking with Rod Demery, retired Shreveport, Louisiana police detective, U.S. military veteran, and also star of the television show Murder Chose Me, which is on Investigation Discovery Channel. We're going to take a short break. We will be right back. We used to have an app, and it was a very popular app. And then, guess what? We couldn't hold a candle to our Facebook presence. How many people have the mobile Facebook app already installed on their phone? How many people use it on their computer? Make sure you follow us. Make sure you like us on our Facebook page. Just search for Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and Podcast, and be sure to send us a comment to one of the posts. Best of all, it's 100% free.
Coverage varies by plan. View contracts and exclusions at endurancewarranty.com.
If you're driving a car or truck with an expired warranty and suddenly lost your transmission or needed a full engine repair, would a $4,000 repair bill leave you stranded? I'm Danica Patrick. Don't get caught off guard with a vehicle breakdown. Choose the company I trust, Endurance. No matter the mileage, if your vehicle is less than 20 years old, Endurance offers comprehensive auto protection plans for any budget. Protection on the drivetrain, electrical, transmission, AC, and more. Plus, benefits like 24/7 roadside assistance and rental car reimbursement on any plan. Endurance handles everything from making the claim through the repair process to paying the certified mechanic of your choice. Don't get caught off guard with a vehicle breakdown. Act now and get 1 full year of elite benefits. A $2,000 value, free.
Visit EnduranceWarranty.com for your fast free quote today. That's EnduranceWarranty.com.
Welcome back to the Law Enforcement Today Show. Joining us, very special guest, Rod Demery, retired Shreveport, Louisiana homicide detective, U.S. military veteran, star of the television show Murder Chose Me on Investigation Discovery Channel Wednesday nights. Check it out. Great show. Rod, one of the things, I did read your bio, and one of the things I saw was they said that you had investigated roughly 250 murders and solved every one and had a confession to everyone. And I know you're not going to be surprised. The police and me went, yeah, right. Because you know how police can be very cynical at times and go, what the heck? But then I started doing the math in my head and said, you know what? It's probably very true. It's probably very accurate. And I knew guys. I knew homicide detectives. I knew uniformed police officers that had such a presence with them and such an ability to talk to people, no matter where they came from, that every time they sat down with a suspect that they knew they did it, they found the button, they found what their trigger points were, and they always got a confession. I wasn't that guy. I got a lot, but I'm nowhere near that caliber. What trait do you think these people like you have that makes that a possibility?
I know exactly what you're talking about because, even the police that I work with are like, how did that happen?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's, when I really think about most of the confessions and the interviews, I try to go back and I realize that, people that kill people want to tell somebody. The difficult part is making yourself that person they want to tell. And traditionally, we would think that when you bring somebody in the box and you're talking to them and you tell them, hey, they're going to go to prison or whatever. Well, some people actually don't care about that. So the trick is to find out exactly what they did care about. And a bunch of innocuous questions will answer that. And, in one instance, it may be because this guy has a girlfriend and he's afraid somebody's going to see his girlfriend when he goes to jail and then they lose everything. Or it's there are different ways to find out. And I think and interrogation, which is probably, in my opinion, the best part of police work, is just that. And I think the other thing is to just be completely unbiased. And if you're not, you have to be that way. They teach us, nonverbal communication and the read technique is a big one. But suspects do the same exact thing. They know when you're judging them. They know when you're going to let the hammer down on them. And I think it's interrogations are probably a game of cat and mouse. But if the police is in control, they're always going to win. That person's vulnerable. And even though it sounds so, contemporary now because everybody talks about it about the first 48, I think that's a reality because if you catch somebody right after a homicide or a suspect right after a homicide, they don't know what you know.
Right.
And it becomes a self-preservation thing. Now you go back 3 weeks later, you're not going to get a confession because they know you don't know anything. Because
they've had time to think it out. Yeah, what I'm going to do.
And psychologically, they've come down. So, But now I can say that about homicide for me. Now, when it comes to other things that I work, like wrecks or DWIs, I totally suck at it, because I just don't know how to do it. There are things that I think God cuts us out for different parts of police work and law enforcement, and some of us, my organization skills were horrible. So there were other detectives that were experts at it. So we had the ability to kind of pull everybody's different talent and make it happen. And, that's when it works. So
you got to have a balance. And, I was a real go-getter, gung-ho, real aggressive, real tenacious, a very proactive guy, loved going after drugs and guns and all that. But you couldn't have a squad all of guys like me because you had to have a balance. Paperwork didn't get done. Routine calls for service didn't get handled. You had everybody out of service at the same time. Those things, now I look back and go, thank goodness we had other guys that were a countermeasure, a counterbalance.
Oh, yeah. And, most police supervisors that have any intelligence about themselves, they do exactly that. You're going to have that one guy that everybody's going to call. They know he's going to stir things up. And you're going to have that peacemaker. You're going to have that guy that's the go-getter. And, I think that whole concept of, good cop, bad cop, and interrogation comes from that, because you have different officers and different investigators that do different things. The mistake is trying to make them do the same thing, and selective, appointments to positions, political reasons or whatever. And I think it should just work. I think the biggest part of policing for investigators or even narcos is the patrol unit. If you've got a good patrol officer, you can go to that officer and say, hey, man, I'm looking for this person. By the end of the day, they'll tell you who his mom is, what they last were arrested for.
Right.
It's a communication thing. So it's certainly not that I was this great police officer. I just had a bunch of great police officers around me.
That's a great point. Because I've had discussions with so many people on the show. When I was, a young officer, I was given my first post, and my sergeant said, you've got to know everybody. You've got to know who the good people are. Most importantly, you got to know who the bad guys are. So that bad guy runs from me. You got to know who he is and where he lives and wind up on his porch.
Right,
banging on the door, talking to his mother, and that's how you solved a lot of cases. So there's so many great neighborhood community police. That was a term. I really don't understand community policing, because that was all I ever knew.
Yeah. And it's second nature. I think somebody, probably kind of optimized on that and kind of politicized it. But the reality is that policemen are always going to be community police. And if you look at police officers, I don't care what part of the country, and if people are able just to look beyond some of the issues, but they would notice, they'd see officers unlikely places.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing to see, some officers that seemingly wouldn't be at a particular place, but that's where their best friends are.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting, and I think that real police, good police, they I think that's a God-given calling, and they follow it. They're always going to be protected. We never make a lot of money, we never get a lot of thank yous, but for whatever reason, we always seem to land on our feet.
Yeah. And I think it's a real passion. For me, it was, I really wanted to be a priest first, and then decided that wasn't in my calling, and policing came right behind that, because it was about, I know it sounds corny, and I know a lot of people say it sounds ideological, but I really wanted to help people, and I wanted to be, to do a service job for people in the community. And that's what 99% of it was doing service work for the community, and not even arresting. That was a small percentage of the job.
Yeah, and it's funny. I actually, when I started studying for my master's, I studied theology, and I always tell people, I'm not a preacher, but I do realize that policing is somewhat of a ministry. Right?
Yeah.
And if you do it right, that's exactly what you do. You help people, and you feel good about it. And basic tenets are, God comforts us in our hours of pain, so we can comfort other people. And I don't think that I would have ever made it through life had I not done that. I mean, my mother was murdered, so going through all that and being able to share that experience with somebody as a homicide detective and having that passion to go help them, it makes you feel better, and you can kind of guide them through what you've been through, and it just works. And I don't think enough people look at it like that, but the way you look at it means that you were just real police. That's what we are.
That's a term that's used so often in Baltimore. when someone say, oh, he's in the department, and they say, well, how was he? They go, he was real police or he was good police. Yeah. Those two were the highest compliments we could give each other. Folks, we're talking with Rod Demery from the television show Murder Chose Me on Investigation Discovery Channel, a retired Shreveport, Louisiana police detective, U.S. military veteran. We're going to take a short break. I promise you we'll be back to the conversation in just a few moments. Don't go anywhere. If you do any business on social media, creating content is one thing. The trick is, how do you turn those people that comment on your social media into consumers? There's a great tool, and you can get more information at letpops.com. That's letpops.com. Best of all, you can get started for free. letpops.com. Check it out today.
Coverage varies by plan. View contracts and exclusions at endurancewarranty.com.
If you're driving a car or truck with an expired warranty and suddenly lost your transmission or needed a full engine repair, would a $4,000 repair bill leave you stranded? I'm Danica Patrick. Don't get caught off guard with a vehicle breakdown. Choose the company I trust, Endurance. No matter the mileage, if your vehicle is less than 20 years old, Endurance offers comprehensive auto protection plans for any budget. Protection on the drivetrain, electrical, transmission, AC, and more. Plus, benefits like 24/7 roadside assistance and rental car reimbursement on any plan. Endurance handles everything, from making the claim through the repair process to paying the certified mechanic of your choice. Don't get caught off guard with a vehicle breakdown. Act now and get 1 full year of elite benefits, a $2,000 value, free.
Visit endurancewarranty.com for your fast free quote today. That's endurancewarranty.com.
John J. Welly joining me. We have Rod Demery. Rod is retired Shreveport, Louisiana police detective, star of the television show Murder Chose Me on Investigation Discovery Channel. Two things that came up that really impressed me, and it's hard not to be impressed by. And I don't mean like, ooh, he hit 500 home runs. I mean impressed by the humanity. One of the lines you say in the show is that murder doesn't want to remain quiet. It wants to be heard. It wants to be discovered. And the other one was you talked about your mom being murdered when you were just a child. Two very powerful situations. And I think let's go to your mom's death. That has to be a huge motivator for what you did.
Yeah, and the irony in that is that I thought I didn't really know a lot about it, but I think that was the motivating factor. I think that drove the natural curiosity, but I think probably it was the thing that made me be able to relate to other people. I think in police work, our passion is what makes us. We may be great and everything else, but if we don't have the passion, we kind of suck.
Right.
So the passion is that I would look at somebody and I would just feel this, like, God, they got to be torn apart like a 5 or 6 year old kid, and I'm at the crime scene. I'm thinking I know what this kid's going to experience. And that was a driving point in my career. And I think those are the things that make us who we are. I mean, we have to be able to relate to people. And my mother's murder was probably the defining moment in my life, and I didn't really even know it at that point.
And it's something you didn't volunteer for. You were just, maybe 3 or 4?
Yeah, I was 3 years old. And, for a 3-year-old, your memory's not really there because I have not a whole lot of memory of my mother. But the memory I do have is the grieving of my grandparents, her mother, and the despair that everyone else experienced, and even some of the fear, that, being, 5 or 6, and this guy hadn't been arrested, how my grandmother was always over paranoid, thinking that, if I go somewhere, that maybe this guy's out there or something, so that's something you take with you. And regardless of the trainer, the college, or the policing, you can't be, you can't be trained to feel that. So when you hit a crime scene, I always tell people when I got to a crime scene, that was the place I felt most natural. Before that, it's like, okay, whatever. But you get to a crime scene, it's like you know what this family's experiencing. And, like police officers, when we talk about our fallen comrades or even soldiers, we say they made the ultimate sacrifice. And I kind of view that as my mother's murder, For her, it produced this child that wanted to go out and work murders and motivate other police officers. And, so you got to kind of try to find the benefit in it. And even though it's difficult, God's plan is always going to be for the greater good. So I think that's something I didn't learn, until I reached 50, obviously. But,
right.
I don't think many police do, especially young officers. They don't know why they're doing their job, but it eventually comes.
I just wanted to go out and chase people and do all the hoorah and the adrenaline. It was such an adrenaline rush in the early days that I don't think I really began to take notice of what was happening. For example, one of the things that always stands out in my mind is, in the wintertime, we wore the heavy wool reefer jackets, we called them, our coats, and in the summer we go to short sleeve shirts. And one of the neighborhoods where I worked, I'm a very hairy guy, blonde hair, and little kids would come talk to you when you have a few moments. And I always loved that, and they would rub my arms because I was such a hairy guy. And I always that will always be near and dear to my heart. But I remember a few years later, one of these young men who'd gotten in the drug game, and wound up shorting the dealer or whatever. And I'm there when he's shot and taking his last breath. And you go, those two scenarios don't jive together, And then when this young man's dying, it's like there's people standing around like it's Saturday night WWE entertainment, eating popcorn and cheering. You're going, this shouldn't be happening. It doesn't make sense, even to today.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be that connection, and I think that's probably what it was. Most children, like if they see you, they look at you as protection and comfort and security, and it's probably that's something they carry through their lives. I mean, I've seen guys that they were the cutest little kids, growing up on the street, and then you see them, and all of a sudden they got tats on their arms and ears, and they're gunning, and you almost don't recognize them. But if you look deep enough, you can still see that kid in there.
He's still there.
And I think, and I think they see the same thing in us. It's like, at the end of the day, they respect us. Oh, yeah.
There's so many guys, and this is another misconception I think people get a lot about policing, is there's so many men in prison that were there because alcohol or drugs, and they did something under the influence they would never do, or they had 5 bad minutes of their life. Now, that's the majority of our prison population. Then you have serious, hardcore, violent career criminals that will never change. And that my interactions, and I'm sure yours too, with a lot of these people that you wound up arresting, wasn't always filled with animosity and hatred towards each other. It was, I understand.
Yeah, and there's always that relationship, and I see it, throughout police work. There are the most unlikely people that are friends. There are people that are hardened criminals that get themselves in trouble somehow, some way, and they'll find a police officer to call. And it's just amazing that the way it's usually portrayed, whether it be the media or politicians, is that there's this huge division, and in some cases they are. I don't want to diminish that at all, but I think it's very understated how there are kids that have actually went through college because there was a police officer that picked them up and gave them rides to school, or and there are police officers that have influenced other children to go to police work, fire departments, in the military, and I think that's understated, and I think that's a shame because the relationships are a lot deeper than that. They're not always antagonistic, and more than likely they're always good. You'll always see the cop joking with the guy on the street.
You do, and it's usually people that maybe chose a wrong side of life we had the most interaction with, and it wasn't always a negative. Really was not. I'm going to go back to that line, and I'm not sure if I got it quite correct, but in the show it says that murder wants to be discovered. It doesn't want to remain silent. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it's never going to be a secret, and like I've always thought in interrogation, the person who commits murder wants to tell, and when you're on the crime scene, the person who's been murdered, there are so many things that they're telling, even though they're not alive, there's so many stories that they're telling, and I think it's just a matter of listening to it and watching the person. Or watching the clues at the crime scene, because it's all just screaming out. I think where we may miss the boat in some cases is that we miss that little thing, because we're always looking for that huge break in the case, but it's usually something really small and subtle, and I think that's why most murder police are the way they are, very, very meticulous, and they look for the smallest things because it doesn't hide. I mean, it streams out. It's just that you have to be listening in the right place to find it.
If you had a chance to tell the community across the United States something they don't understand about policing, what would that be?
I like to tell them that we, as police officers, and anybody that is a police officer, if they've made it past their fifth year in law enforcement, they're pretty good people. Very rarely do they not get weeded out early on, and certainly that I wouldn't want people or the community to think that all police officers are good, because just like all doctors or nurses aren't good. But by and large, if you find a police officer, his only motivation is to help people. They certainly don't do it for the money. They don't do it for the accolades. They don't do it for anything other than they feel like they have something to give. The most incredible thing about police officers, especially the hardcore patrol officers, is that they would risk their life for anybody at any time. And, it's not to say that people shouldn't look at their police departments and make sure they're running right, because I think they should. But at the same time, it's difficult to paint the entire profession, or calling, I should probably say, with a broad brush, because sometimes the officers that don't look that good are probably the best people ever.
Absolutely. And by the way, you made a comment earlier about being tatted up. I've seen photos. You've got tattoos. I have them too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That was a Navy thing.
Well, mine started late in life, and I always tell people I want to get more, but the problem is twofold. Either I don't have the time or I have the money. When I have the money, I don't have time, and vice versa.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a teenage kid that was talking about tattoos. I said, well, have you ever been in the military? Are you in a bike gang? Have you been to prison? If you can't answer any of those questions, then you really can't.
You better wait a while. I always tell people, wait until you're older to decide it's something you really, really want, because what was really cool when you're 19, you're going to hate when the time you hit 39.
You're going to hate exactly.
Rod Demery, I want to thank you so much for your time, and I really want to thank you for your service, both in the Navy and in policing, and really what you're doing for the police community by telling these stories in the television show Murder Chose Me on Investigation Discovery Channel. Rod Demery, thanks so much, man. You have a good one and appreciate it.
Thank you. God bless.
This was a podcast version of the nationally syndicated Law Enforcement Talk radio show, and we are so glad that you decided to join us. Big thanks to our guests for telling their story on the show. Two simple things you can do. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com. That's letradio.com. And be sure to follow us or like us on Facebook. Do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. And be sure when you see a post that we put up that you like, that you resonate with, that gets your attention, be sure to share it with your friends. Back in just a few days, another episode of the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and Podcast. Until then, this is John J. Wiley. See ya.